Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hi, this is Doc Frank. Welcome back to my podcast. The idea of this podcast in 2024 is to address some of the most pressing issues of the rail industry. One of the topics that will definitely be very hot this year, especially here in Australia where I live, is the topic of interoperability. For me specifically, the interoperability of what's called digital signaling. Digital signaling is probably not much else than a different term for automatic train control. So technologies such as CBTC, communication-based train control, ETCS, European Train Control System, two very popular mainstream examples of automatic train control, or in other words, digital signaling. The interoperability between those technologies and even within those technologies is really a big thing here in Australia, because many railways here are currently introducing those new technologies, and there is a certain risk to introduce a so-called digital gauge break, which means that you create a signaling landscape where the different systems don't really work with each other anymore, and where a train may not be able to operate across multiple signaling systems when these are new digital signaling systems. So the way this episode will work is that I'm going to kind of interview myself. You will see the questions coming up, which are read out by an AI bot, but I hope to find a nice sounding one. And then I will answer those. I hope you enjoy this format. Please let me know in the comments if you do, and let me know personally if you don't. If you like the podcast, then there are plenty of other episodes where I actually do interview other people. So please check those out. Subscribe, let your friends know about this, because all of that will help moving this show forward and motivating me to keep going for the sake of the railway industry. Thank you. Before we start, a quick word from our sponsor, which is Doc Frank Training. Hi, it's Doc Frank again. What can I say? Even the best CBTC training in the world arguably can get even better. And that's what's happened with the brand new 2024 Understanding CBTC Fundamentals training. This is an upgrade from the previous CBTC Kickstarter training that exists since 2014 and has been continuously refined, improved, and updated. You have a massive 30 video lessons that you can watch on demand as long as you live. You've got lifelong access. You can build a certifiable CBTC competency, and the certification is offered by me as well as an additional option. You do not need prior signaling knowledge for this training. Just imagine that you can learn the fundamentals of CBTC without needing to know anything about railway signaling before the training. So that really makes it suitable for anybody working in the railway industry and for anybody being interested in working in the railway industry. The training is topped up by an industry-leading Q&A support over at least 12 months. You can sign up for this fantastic training under docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC. And if you needed one additional argument, this course is actually cheaper than last year's training. So that's my way of helping you fighting inflation. Hope you enjoy, and I hope to see you at this CBTC training.
What was your first experience with interoperability?
Well, my first experience with interoperability obviously came from Europe. You will hear from my accent that I'm not a born and bred Aussie or Australian. I'm originally from Germany. I worked in Europe for the majority of my railway career for the first 17 years, which is still more than half of it. Currently at 33, so just under half. And between 1999 and 2008, I had quite a bit of interaction with the European Train Control System, ETCS. And of course, interoperability is one of the hallmark features of ETCS because it was meant to unify and harmonize automatic train protection technologies all across Europe. So my observation over the years with ETCS interoperability was that, first of all, there were very few initial ETCS projects and they were quite a bit spread out. So they were in different countries. The railway lines applying ETCS were quite a bit apart from each other. So in the early outset, there wasn't really a need for interoperability. And to be fair, with the new technology, every project had more than enough to do to just implement ETCS as it was and as the respective project saw fit. There were some examples of interoperability, first of all, there were some examples of cross-border traffic. For example, between Austria and Hungary, that was, I believe, the first cross-border application of ETCS, which was hugely celebrated. But at the end of the day, that was the same supplier on both sides of the border. So the big success here really was to have an ETCS that was acceptable to both the Austrian and the Hungarian side, and having a train crossing the border with just a single system for automatic train protection, which was ETCS level 1 at the time. Then later there were some examples for interoperability, but it was hard. It was an uphill struggle, and the more countries implemented ETCS and tried to get to a status of interoperability between different ETCS projects, the more they found out that it's actually not quite that easy. And there's a lot of testing required, and there was also a lot of rework required. So interoperability with ETCS is not quite as straightforward as people would hope for. And so that was pretty much my first experience with interoperability up to the point where I migrated from Europe to Australia.
What do you think about interoperability in Australia?
The timing of my migration to Australia was really second to none with regards to interoperability, because the year that I arrived there in 2009, there was a newly created working group to write an Australian standard for signaling interoperability. It wasn't called signaling for the standard, it was called TPC, Train Protection and Control Systems, but that was literally the same that is today called digital signaling, or which could also be called automatic train control. So it was about having all these new and modern technologies, for example, ETCS, and bringing them together all across the vast Australian country. And the experience in this working group was really quite unique. I was a participant in this working group. My employer delegated me to be part of this working group because obviously I just came from Europe. I had an ETCS background and I knew a thing or two about interoperability. So it made a lot of sense for me to get there. And unsurprisingly, there were a few people in that workshop, in that working group, that pushed very hard for ETCS. They basically said, well, look, Europe is doing interoperability. They're doing it with ETCS. So all we need to do in Australia is to use ETCS and everything will be fine. Now, as you have heard from my previous response about my experience in Europe, it's not quite as simple as that, but never mind. The bigger problem was that one railway organization with a network that connects really to everything else, which is the interstate network in Australia, which connects all the major cities in Australia. The operator of that network was the first one going rogue. The first one saying, well, yeah, that's a nice idea with ETCS in Europe, but we are not going to use ETCS. Thank you very much. We're doing something else. And off they went. And in my perspective, that was pretty much the end of that interoperability discussion. And everything after that, including the writing of the standard, could be not much more than a smallest common denominator without much teeth, without much power to really achieve anything and change anything in the industry. And unfortunately, this is exactly how it panned out. So the Australian standard AS7666, with all due respect to those who worked on it and wrote it, it was a pretty hard job. It was really a toothless tiger that was more a recommendation than anything else. It definitely didn't have the powers to enforce any change and to push railway organizations towards interoperable solutions. So that status from 2009, or I think it was 2010, when that standard was eventually published for the first time, things haven't really changed much since then. And interestingly, a couple of years ago, I was part of another working group which was tasked with the rewrite, with the update of the Australian standard AS7666. And again, the outcome, unsurprisingly, wasn't much better than the first time. There was a lot of debate, all up to the point whether it made sense at all to write the standard or not. And at the end of it, we ended up with a standard with some better explanations than the first time around, but it still didn't really have any teeth. So what's happening recently in the last year was a really interesting thing, which may give a lot of more drive to that whole interoperability topic here in Australia, because the politicians got aware of it, that there would be a problem. There has been something which is called a National Rail Action Plan, and lack of interoperability was in fact identified as one of the major risks for this Rail Action Plan. And it was propagated that the introduction of different systems for digital signaling or automatic train control could really lead to a so-called digital gauge break. A gauge break, just for background, the gauge is normally the distance between the two rails of a railway track. And if you have different gauges, that normally means that a train which has wheels, axles at a certain distance can run on the one gauge, but not on the other gauge. There are a few exceptions to that, but there are few and far between. So normally, if you have two different railway gauges, and in Australia we actually have three of those. We have narrow gauge, we have standard gauge, and we have broad gauge. Then trains with one gauge can't normally run on tracks of another gauge. So that's called a gauge break. And the risk here really was to create a digital gauge break by introducing this new digital signaling technologies, where trains may not have a problem with different rail gauges because they are identical, but they may have a similar problem of interoperability because of different digital signaling systems in different parts of the country. So what happened since was that the politicians, the government, the federal government became alert. And they went on a journey, on a tour across all the Australian states and territories to talk to the state politicians, to the state governments, and also to the local rail operators. And they signed a memorandum of collaboration where all the states basically committed to work on better interoperability for rail. So this is where we stand in Australia in early 2024, and now it will be most interesting to see what's really happening in practice based on this political drive to improve interoperability.
What do you see as risks for interoperability of digital signaling in Australia?
I had to change the settings here because the camera wasn't quite responsive. There's a variety of risks for interoperability, or when dealing with interoperability, striving towards interoperability, all of these things. And predominantly, I think the biggest risk is a lack of understanding. A lack of understanding what interoperability is in the first place. Lack of understanding how interoperability can be achieved, and also a lack of understanding where interoperability is really necessary and where it should rather be avoided. A lack of understanding often leads to confusion. That means people are discussing something and there is crosstalk simply because they don't really understand each other. Somebody has a certain understanding of what the other person is saying, but that's really not what the other person meant. It sounds very simplistic, but I keep seeing this all the time in discussions about the topic, that people are not really clear what kind of interoperability they mean and what facet of interoperability they talk about. More often than not, people don't even understand that there are different facets of interoperability, different aspects, and that obviously makes it very difficult to understand the topic and to find solutions for problems inside that topic. Another major risk that I have seen time and again here in Australia, but even in Europe, is misunderstanding or a false assumption that when using ETCS, the European Train Control System, interoperability will come automatically by default. It will fall off the skies, so to say. And this is simply not true. And there are case studies galore from Europe, but most people don't really want to see that. They don't want to acknowledge that because they think, well, we are spending a lot of money for ETCS because of the interoperability feature of ETCS, and therefore we just don't want to understand, we just don't want to know about that this interoperability may not come by default. So fingers crossed, all will be fine. And unfortunately, that's very often not the case. Interoperability for ETCS requires work. And for other technologies, it's even worse. CBTC, for example, the products of different suppliers are by default not interoperable. They don't talk to each other. They don't work with each other. So that is an even bigger problem that metro organizations around the world have been dealt with for years and have found solutions and workarounds for many years, if not decades. Another major risk to interoperability, and especially now with a lot of political pressure there to achieve interoperability, is that people go there with an all or nothing approach, and they overestimate the benefits of interoperability. So I have seen arguments for interoperability which I don't think will stack up when it comes to commercial realities. So it's one thing to sign a document, collaboration memorandum or whatever they're called, and say, we want to do our best to strive for interoperability, and it will be a good thing for all of Australia or whatever other country they are discussing interoperability. But then they are faced with a hard reality where they said, well, our rollout here of digital signaling technology will cost us, I don't know, $50 million, $100 million, whatever more, if we cater for interoperability with another rail authority. And the benefits of that interoperability will be not for us who spends the money for that, it will be for somebody else. And the benefits even for somebody else may be quite limited. I think these will be commercial realities that when they hit, then it may turn out that the potential benefits of interoperability were grossly overestimated, and then the whole thing may fall into a heap. And that's actually the last risk that I want to mention. It's the attempt to do too much. To take 100 or black and white approach, or 100 or 0 approach to interoperability. So trying to get to interoperability everywhere between all the railway authorities in Europe, even though their operational requirements may be fundamentally different, which is a big difference from Europe, where the railways are just more similar to each other than what we have here in many parts of Australia. And then the risk is, if you try to do everything and you face obstacles, or you realize that doing everything, making everything interoperable is just not feasible, it's just not affordable financially, then you basically fall back and say, oh well, then we can do nothing. Yeah, so I think the truth will be somewhere in between, that you need to choose very carefully where you really need interoperability, and then come up with a specific solution for each and every interoperability problem, how to address this. I think this will be the silver bullet, if you will, to solve interoperability in Australia.
How did you get to develop a training course on interoperability?
The history of my training on interoperability, that was actually quite a funny story. A few years back, I think it was around 2017, 18 or so, I was contacted by an employee from the Department of Infrastructure in Canberra. And the Department of Infrastructure is also responsible for a number of other things, regional development and transport. So the rail transport space really falls squarely into the responsibility of that Department of Infrastructure. And the name of that department has changed a few times, so I'm just using Department of Infrastructure as an overall placeholder. So the person said, well, I've heard the presentation that you did about CBTC a few years ago. I know you do CBTC trainings, so I want you to do a CBTC training for members of our department. And I said, yeah, that's fine, not a problem, I can do that. And then he said, well, but your training is normally over 2 days, and we only have 1 day, so we want to finish the whole training in 1 day. And I said, that's fine. I can cut my training shorter and customize it to basically have a 1-day training, which gives you all the essentials that I'm normally teaching over 2 days. Of course, I can't teach everything, but I can cut some things out which are maybe not as important as the things that I'm teaching in 1 day. So that works. Okay, so we kind of agreed on that. A couple of days later, the next email came along and said, we would also want to know about ETCS. And I said, that's fine. I've got an ETCS training as well. So I can basically take some parts from my CBTC training. I can take some parts from my ETCS training. And I can put it together to basically fill a day and tell you about CBTC and ETCS. Okay, another couple of days later, another email came and said, well, we would actually also want to know about ATMS, which is the digital signaling system that's being developed and introduced to the interstate network in Australia. Can you do that as well? And while you're at it, what we are really interested in, and now we came to the point, is how to make all these systems work together. So in short, interoperability between those systems. And I thought, wow, this is really a completely new training. For one, I didn't have an existing training on ATMS. I only offered CBTC and ETCS trainings at the time. And I hadn't really looked into interoperability too much myself, at least not in developing a training course. So I mean, I still said I can do it. The opportunity was just too good to say no. But I said this will be a completely new training course, but it will certainly fit your bill. It will match your purpose. They were fine with that. So I got an order for doing a training course for 15 people. And I developed a new training, which included CBTC basics, ETCS basics, the basics of ATMS, the Advanced Train Management System for the interstate network, and also some thoughts and ideas about interoperability between those systems. I called this new training course Automatic Train Control and Interoperability. Automatic train control simply because that's kind of an umbrella term that can be used for CBTC and for ETCS and for ATMS. And then talking about the interoperability between those systems. And this is how this first training course came to life. The department in Canberra was very happy with the outcome. They said they learned a lot. And after that, I've done a couple of other runs for other clients in the space. So that has been quite a successful training, which still exists, but which is just undergoing an update for 2024 to stay in touch with the recent developments in this space.
What is new for your interoperability training in 2024?
Well, the first change or the first update for 2024 is really a different use of terms. So the initiative, the national initiative for interoperability in Australia is currently using the term digital signaling. So they're not talking about automatic train control. They're talking about digital signaling because they think that's the most fitting term that's understandable by politicians and by all the other stakeholders involved. So I have renamed this training course from previously automatic train control and interoperability to what's now called digital signaling interoperability. Now, a name change alone probably doesn't cut it. That would be a bit too much superficial. So I've also looked through the content and I have updated that. So what's still there are some basic definitions, like starting at ground zero, what is signaling, then what is meant by digital signaling. It's basically the same as automatic train control. What is meant by that? What are the basic functionalities of automatic train control? And then lastly, what's the definition of interoperability for the sake of this training course? I mean, there are various definitions of interoperability, all to the point that you can look it up on Wikipedia, and then you see a very generic definition of interoperability between systems, whatever systems are. But if you really look at the specific interoperability in the railway space for digital signaling, this is what it means. The next thing I'm doing in the training is explaining three-layer framework, which I called SPA, S-P-A, of systems, products, and applications. And the idea of explaining this framework is to create clarity and to avoid confusion, because I've seen a lot of confusion in this space where people throw together comparing different things from different levels of this three-layer model, and it confuses them. It gets them completely into the woods. There's crosstalk created, and they don't understand each other. So that's obviously not helpful if you try to solve a complex problem. So therefore, I'm teaching a framework that creates clarity in that space where people know, okay, I'm at this level, discussing at this level, or I'm at that level, or at the third level. And from experience from the previous training, that framework really helps a lot to create clarity in the room. And I had a lot of aha moments there in previous training courses. What I'm doing then is to give quick basic introductions on the three main technologies for digital signaling that we have here in Australia, one being CBTC, the communications-based train control. Obviously, this cannot be a full-blown CBTC training, but it's just one lesson to explain some basics of CBTC and, importantly, the similarities and the differences to the other technologies. Then I have a similar basic lesson for ETCS, the European Train Control System, and then lastly a similar lesson for ATMS, the Advanced Train Management System, so that all three technologies for digital signaling which are used in Australia are properly explained and can be brought in comparison between each other. The next thing I do, and I then really go into the topic of interoperability, and I have added a couple of things that I previously didn't have. So a few years ago, when I developed the original training course, Automatic Train Control and Interoperability, I hadn't done research in the field of CBTC interoperability. That means interoperability between different CBTC products from different suppliers. So these days I have a specific lesson on CBTC interoperability as part of my CBTC trainings. And this lesson, or at least a somewhat condensed version of that lesson, will be integrated in this course on digital signaling interoperability as well. Then I have another edition where I'm talking about ETCS interoperability. And that goes back to what I previously identified as a risk, that people think that when they choose ETCS, then interoperability will come automatically. And it doesn't. But in this lesson, I explain why it doesn't come automatic, interoperability for ETCS, and also what can be done to create and to ensure interoperability between ETCS from different suppliers and maybe even in different jurisdictions. And then lastly, I talk about approaches for interoperability between the different technologies. And that's really getting, well, you can say interesting or you can say difficult, because something like this has hardly ever done before in the world. So you may say that Australia is trying to do something that nobody else has ever done. But it's a problem that once resolved may be very interesting for other railway jurisdictions as well, that have the challenge of bringing different technologies for digital signaling together. So all of this will create an updated and an up-to-speed training course on digital signaling, different technologies, and interoperability. If you ask whether this would just be applicable to Australia, it will obviously be focused on Australia because there's so much going on here at the moment in this country, and also here's my biggest base of customers. So I'm creating this course predominantly for the situation in Australia. However, CBTC and ETCS are global technologies that are used in many, many different countries around the world, not just Australia. And I think that the majority of this training will be of interest for anybody in the world who has a challenge regarding interoperability. And it will help improving their understanding, and it will also help them to find and to think about practical solutions for an interoperability challenge.
What future do you expect for digital signaling interoperability in Australia?
What's the outlook for interoperability in Australia? Now, people got very excited last year when there was this political initiative of signing all these memorandums of collaboration, and everybody thinks, now things are really going off and a lot of things will happen. We need to see. As I said earlier, when these ambitions for interoperability get hit by commercial realities, we need to see what's going to happen. So I give you an example. If say, for example, one of the early adopters or of the current users of ETCS Level 2 is the Cross River Rail project in Brisbane, which is a very prestigious project. It's I believe, the biggest rail transport project that has ever been done in Queensland. Everybody's very proud of that project. It's a very important project. So say it would come to a situation where the signaling solution for Cross River Rail needs a rework to achieve interoperability with another jurisdiction, say with Sydney. And that rework of the signaling technology would put the opening date of the project, of the Cross River Rail project, at risk. Would you really think they do that? No, I didn't think either. So this is just one example where the realities of project pressures and maybe commercial consequences as well may actually overturn all the good intentions regarding interoperability. So what I'm hoping for is a gradual movement towards interoperability, that the intention to get closer to interoperability where it's really needed. Maybe I take a step back. That's really the first step, to look at the railway landscape in Australia. And I think some people in Canberra are doing that already, creating a so-called interoperability map, and then identifying where interoperability is really needed between different rail authorities or for different applications, for different train journeys. And then think about what are the most practicable solutions for that specific case of interoperability. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all. If you try to find a one-size-fits-all approach in Australia, things will fail. That's a guarantee I can give you straight away. I've seen too much in the field of interoperability to tell you otherwise. But specific applications of interoperability and finding practical solutions for those specific applications, that may work. And in fact, that's probably the only way that it may work. And I hope that we will have people working on that who really know what they're talking about, who understand what they're talking about. In that regard, I do believe that more training of those people working on interoperability is really a good idea. And I'm not only saying that because I provide training on digital systems interoperability, and in fact, I'm the only one in Australia providing such training about digital signaling interoperability, but simply because I believe that people who work on this topic will have it much, much easier if they have a real solid understanding of what they're talking about. So, yeah, at the end of this podcast interview, I will provide you a link and will tell you how to get access to that training, which will be ready for consumption in about a month from now, maximum. So probably end of February, early March, something like that, 2024. And I can only cross my fingers, because interoperability is certainly an interesting thing. It does have benefits in certain applications more than in others. And and at the end of the day, that's what our governments expect from us in the industry here in Australia. So fingers crossed that we get something meaningful done, and I will do my best to help the industry with provision of this training and whatever else people think I can help it with. Thanks very much for listening, and now we go over to the link for the training. Hi, this is Doc Frank. I need to tell you about my brand new cutting edge 2024 training, Digital Signaling Interoperability. Interoperability is such a huge issue, not just here in Australia, but in other countries as well. Everywhere where you've got different railway authorities with cross traffics between each other. This course has the latest insights, the latest research. This training includes the SPA framework, systems, products, and applications, which creates a lot of clarity and avoids confusion in that area. We then look at the different technologies for digital signaling in Australia. And this is just an example that is transferable to many, many other countries in the world. We then give detailed introductions to the main technologies used in Australia, which are CBTC, ETCS, and ATMS. Then we discuss the hierarchy of interoperability controls, the different ways how interoperability can be handled and addressed. A special session on CBTC interoperability between CBTC products from different suppliers. Then we look at ETCS interoperability. And if you think that comes automatic just by using ETCS, you need to think again. This lesson will address how interoperability in practice can be achieved with ETCS, and it does require some work. And then lastly, interoperability between different technologies. What is required to do that, to achieve that? Which options are available and what is arguably the best? You can get access to this fantastic brand new training under docfranktraining.podia.com/interoperability. I repeat that again, docfranktraining.podia.com/interoperability. If this is a topic of concern for you and your railway organization, then don't miss this training. Hi, it's Doc Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry. And I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share. And until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.